Okay, afternoon everybody. I hope you can hear me. Just pause in case you can't. I'll assume yes. Great. Yeah, good afternoon. My name's Jen Armand. I'm the Programme Manager for District Level Licensing in Natural England. Just a tiny bit about myself before we start. My background is in behavioural ecology, and I've been working for Natural England for about 10 years now. I started in local delivery and protected sites in Norfolk, and I moved to I've had a couple of national policy roles in head office in Natural England, and more recently, for the last 15 months or so, I've been leading the district level licensing programme, which has definitely been my most exciting and challenging role to date. So you may or may not know that this is the fifth and final webinar that we've been doing on district level licensing. So we've tried to break down district level licensing into the approach, the scheme design, the evidence base, and this final webinar is the specifics on how to apply to the Natural England-led scheme. So at the moment, the Natural England-led scheme is only available in Kent and Cheshire, but we are looking to roll out elsewhere in coming months, and we'll touch on that at the end. But this is very much about the application process. So what we will cover today, we'll cover that end-to-end licensing process. Alex will take you through that, who's our lead. We'll look at some of the complexities that we've been working through, some changes and improvements. We'll touch on some of the case studies, so some of the applicants which we've already got in the scheme, just so you can get a sense of that. And then we'll wrap up with a look to the future, so where DLL will become available and what we're working on to improve and monitor the scheme. So I will hand over now to my colleague Alex, and he will get into the detail for you. Thanks.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me. My name is Alex Jackson. I'm a GCN strategist in the district licensing team. I've been in post for about a year and a half now. And my main role is involved with the live running of schemes. It's been Kent and Cheshire so far, but I'm sure that'll extend to the future schemes coming up. I've been with Natural England about 4.5 years, and I spent 3 years as a wildlife advisor, working on traditional licensing assessments, predominantly for great crested newts. So the customer journey is simplified on this slide. There are 4 steps, the first of which the applicant will inquire to Natural England, and we will confirm the eligibility of district licensing and also how much it will cost. We'll provide this to the applicant in the form of a certificate that, once signed, form a contract between us and the applicant, so that district licensing can be used to account for the impacts on GCN as a result of the applicant's development. And this signed quotation will inform the applicant's planning application. They can use that to gain planning permission. Once planning is granted, the applicant will pay Natural England what we had denoted on the certificate and submits a licence application, which will just be the reason statement part of an application. We no longer need to assess a method statement. And the final step, the licence is granted and works affecting GCN can legally proceed. So those of you familiar with the traditional licensing approach see that there's no change in steps 3 and 4. You'd normally engage with Natural England after planning had been obtained. So we've introduced this pre-planning step, the inquiry process, which, although it looks like extra admin, we hope will streamline the licensing process overall. The first question you may have when looking to use district licensing is asking whether you should survey or not. So if you've seen in previous webinars, district licensing provides an alternative to doing site-specific surveys, and instead you can use our risk zone maps which predict GCN presence and absence. This dataset can be found on Natural England's open data portal, so you can check whether your site falls within an amber or green risk zone, or even a red zone where we won't be using district licensing. If there are already existing surveys for your site, these must be provided to us, and this is to avoid a situation where we might undercompensate for a site because we're assuming a 50% occupancy rate. Survey information is backdated up to 4 years. This has been changed recently from 2 years, and this is to make the timings more consistent with the traditional licensing approach, because they go between 2 and 4 years of age, and this way we won't miss again potentially sites that had historic survey with high occupancy that was beyond that 2-year cutoff that we had originally. So we think this will help get the best possible compensation outcome for sites. Enquire Natural England, we have an inquiry form on the gov.uk website. After that form is filled in, you must provide to us a GIS shapefile with your red line boundary on, as well as this same boundary on a PDF as well. If you have done survey work, this data should also be provided on a GIS polygon of ponds on site and also within 250 metres, denoting the presence and absence of GCN on these ponds. You'll need to pay an inquiry fee of £670 plus VAT, and this is for us to cost recover the work done on the impact assessment. This inquiry fee, as I said, is a cost recovery, so it may be periodically reviewed in future if we're finding we can carry out that impact assessment in a more streamlined way. For the impact assessment, we will calculate the impact your site has on ponds, with ponds within your site and within 250 metres. For a no survey case, we'll double check the risk zone your site falls in, if you haven't done already. And we will use the red line boundary to calculate impact. So we'll just run through an example of this. So we've got our hypothetical site with the red line boundary. We'll apply a 250 metre buffer to that site and see how many ponds fall within that. We've got 1 pond inside the boundary of the site and 3 more within 250 metres. We look at 250 metre buffer around those ponds, and now we can see how much habitat of the site falls within the total habitat of those ponds. And we do a calculation which is total habitat lost divided by total habitat. So this shaded area within the site shows how much of the habitat within 250 metres of each pond is effectively being functionally lost by the development site. For the no survey route, we merge any overlaps. And so you can see the figures are 10.45 hectares of shaded area within the site and 55 hectares of area within the dashed buffers around the ponds. So if you were to times this by 100, this will give you a percentage of total habitat loss, but we'll leave it as 0.19 to start with. We multiply this by 3, which is the number of ponds outside the boundary, and this gives us 0.57. We'll round this up to the nearest 0.1 to be precautionary, and this gives us 0.6 impact off-site. We're losing 1 pond within the site, so we add that on, and that leaves us with 1.6 impact. Because the site is within an amber zone, we'll multiply this by 2, which is the amber multiplier, and this gives us 3.2 compensation ponds required for the whole site. If it had been in a green zone, it would have just been a 1 times multiplier, so it would have been half that. The same site again, but we have obtained survey information for it. So we've got pond 1 and pond 2 to the north of the site, both occupied, and pond 3 and pond 4 are absent. We've got separate compensation multipliers for each of these occupancies. So present ponds are 4 times, absent 1 times, and if there is no data, it would be 2 times. For the survey route, we look at each pond individually. We'll do that same formula of looking at habitat lost with lost to the development divided by the total habitat around that pond. So we've got those figures of 0.12, 0.27 for those 2 ponds to the north, 1 because we're losing that pond 3, and 0.06 from the pond which is furthest from the site. Multiply those by those occupancy multipliers, 4, 4 and 1, 1, and that gives us the compensation requirements for each of those ponds. Summed together, it comes out as 2.7. Let's flip around those occupancies if it had been a different scenario, and pond 3 and pond 4 are now occupied. Running through those calculations again, you come out with a different compensation requirement of 4.6. So it's greater than before, and this is because pond 3 is now occupied and it's within the development site, so therefore the compensation requirements are greater. So all 3 examples have the same occupancy of 50%, but we've come out with very different compensation requirements, and this is because it depends on where that pond is, how close it is to the site, or whether it's on the site. Once we know how many ponds are required for the site, we will allocate them out of our pond bank. This is quite a simplified version, and we can allocate hundreds of ponds due to the time lag multiplier, 1.1, which I haven't incorporated onto this for simplicity's sake. And it also doesn't account for contingency ponds, which we also build into our pond bank. So we may have had 5 developments before the examples we looked at before have asked to join the scheme, so we've been allocating ponds against them. These developments are of varying sizes and therefore varying pond requirements. So at this point in time, we're left with 4.5 ponds spare. So if we use that initial no survey calculation we did of 3.2 ponds, we will allocate those to that development, and we've now got a small amount of ponds left. So obviously there's potential for there to be temporary caps to the scheme when we run out of ponds. So if a large development came in, we wouldn't be able to service them with 1.3 ponds spare. But what we hope will happen is that over time, those developments, 1 or 2 that came in earlier in the process, will be able to obtain planning, apply for a license and pay the conservation payment that we had asked, and that then allows us to fund other ponds. If we can't service your development, we'll tell you so at the very start and you won't have to pay anything. Although we do offer, we can run through the impact assessment and give you an indication of what the compensation requirements are and the cost, in which case we will charge for the inquiry fee, but obviously you won't be able to join at that point in time. So we provide the costs, as I've said, in the impact assessment and conservation payment certificate, which is shortened to the IACPC. So for that example we've been looking at, 3.2 compensation ponds is multiplied by the cost per pond, which is 15,165. We add VAT to that, and that comes to a total of just over 58,000. So the applicant will need to weigh up the costs and benefits of using district licensing if they are also considering the traditional approach. And if they come to the conclusion that paying for DLL can get the best outcome for their site, then they'll sign up on the certificate and return it to us. We'll then countersign the certificate, and it now forms an agreement to join the DLL scheme. Whilst the certificate is unsigned, it's only going to be valid for 3 months. And this is a recent change we've made to avoid situations where developments hang on because, as I said, we allocate ponds at the inquiry stage. We want to make sure we can reallocate ponds to more urgent developments when they come in. We made the decision to allocate at the inquiry stage because it's the safest thing to do. If we were to wait until the licensing stage, if we let loads of developments in, we might then find that we didn't have enough ponds and we couldn't license half of them, which obviously is a worse scenario at that later stage. Once you've got a signed certificate from both parties, you can obtain planning permission, and the certificate demonstrates due regard for GCN. Planning is still a requirement before applying for a license, the same as for traditional licensing. However, we no longer require full planning permission to apply for a license, or the reserve matters either. Because historically license assessments would require full planning to be in place, because it gave sufficient certainty that a development would proceed and the initial destructive works which might impact GCN would be required. As district licensing assumes full site loss, compensates as such, we no longer need that same level of planning certainty in order to get a license. If you've already obtained planning permission, the applicant can go from the certificate stage straight to the application for a license. But we do ask just to make sure that you check your planning conditions and make sure that you can still adhere to those by switching your GCN mitigation route, licensing route. We've got a new application form for district licensing, and you complete that and provide a reason statement if that's required to Natural England. At this stage, we will then invoice for the conservation payment, so 58,000 in this example. On receipt of this, we will then start the assessment process, which is just the reason statement, and these are being assessed through a different work stream, so not with the licensing services current workload. So we do hope that that these will get assessed promptly, although we're still maintaining that it's 30 working days, a customer charter deadline. And once we receive payment and assess the reason statement, a license can be issued. In accordance with the habitat regulations, because we have killing and injury on the license, it can only last a maximum of 2 years. We anticipate that most development sites, destructive works won't extend beyond that for the most part, but if you do require a new license, you can request this from us up to a minimum of 2 months prior to the license's expiry, and we'll just do a quick check to make sure that the impacts are still as they were we first looked at them 2 years before, and we'll just charge a new license fee for renewal of that license. We attach a document detailing best practice guidance to the license, and that just gives you an idea of what you can do under that license. Obviously, we aren't specifying any mitigation that has to happen on site, but it does just provide a guide of what you can do if you do find a GCN on site. There's a few complexities that district licensing has that I'll briefly go through. So phase developments, there are 3 different options. The first one, where we have the same developer for all phases, is the most simple option. In that scenario, we would run the impact assessment on all of the phases as one development boundary and calculate the impacts from that, and issue one certificate to the developer. Where we have different developers for each phase, maybe where the initial developer has sold off phases, or we have a multi-plot site where we've got completely unrelated developments right next to each other, we will need to provide separate certificates to each phase owner, and therefore run separate impact assessments. And we might get scenarios where we have ponds within the boundary of each site, but also within the buffer of each phase. So if you can see on the diagram, we've got an extra phase on that site we were looking at, but that pond might be lost at a later stage, but we've already calculated impact on that pond for the purposes of the second phase. So we've created a living pond layer, which is still being worked through, but that will help track the status of ponds, especially with phase development, so we know when ponds are being lost. We will have to include these ponds when we're doing calculations, but if it can be proved to us that a pond has been lost from an earlier phase, we can recalculate, because obviously there'll be no impact on that pond once the second phase commences. If district licensing is applied for adjacent to an existing mitigation license, we will do a check to make sure that that license won't be contravened in any way by using district licensing adjacent to it. We haven't quite tested this yet. We can convert licenses in principle to district licensing, but yeah, we still need to work through that system. So we've just got some examples of development sites which have used district licensing. Chilmington Green was the very first one that came in for Kent and district licensing overall, which was a large multi-phase development with 5,500 homes and infrastructure. And we worked closely with them just before the scheme launched. They were very keen to use it for their latest phase, and their payments funded 6 new ponds. So this was a good example of a large housing development making use of district licensing. Public services have also inquired. We've had an NHS new development site that has inquired through district licensing and has agreed to the costs that we provided for them. They're still at early stages, but it's really good to see the NHS register their interest in district licensing. And it means that they can have peace of mind going forward that GCN won't cause problems at a later stage. Industry, we've had the first development site in Cheshire to be licensed, was a commercial development. There weren't any ponds on site, but there were quite a few ponds within 250 metres just outside the red line boundary. And the applicant had already applied for a traditional mitigation licence, but due to lack of space for habitat creation on site, they hadn't been able to obtain a licence and had been issued a further information request. And as district licensing had just launched in Cheshire, they decided to try that route instead, and we were able to get them through the system and avoid any more delays, and it cost them 24,000 in the end. And the consultant especially was pleased that they could get a quick turnaround through district licensing and avoid those delays that may have continued to occur through the traditional route. And finally, we've got an example of infrastructure. Network Rail in Kent needed to do track renewals and repairs within a tunnel. They hadn't carried out any surveys, but there were 10 ponds within 250 metres, and it was within an amber zone. So there was a good chance that GCN would have been present in that area of the country. And GCN are obviously known to use railway lines as hibernation habitat, and works needed to commence in November. So if they may have had to have waited until the next survey season to determine whether GCN were present or not, and obviously that would have caused a lot of delay and cost for them. But by being able to go through district licensing, they had a very small footprint of works, which meant the payment was small, just 4,000, and through a timely receipt of their license, they could commence their works without any delay.
Okay. Thanks, Alex. Back to me for the end point of the presentation. So Alex is sort of taking you step by step through the process, and we'll come to the questions and answers at the end if there's anything we can clarify. But I thought I'd just give you a bit of a sense of the interest to date in Kent and Cheshire. So it's been quite a sort of a healthy pipeline from our perspective, especially considering that we didn't actually do very much upfront promotion or marketing of the scheme before we launched in those areas, because we wanted to be sure that we could provide an excellent customer service and respond to applicants well. So this slide gives a sort of an overview of what the activity that we've had in Kent and Cheshire, and just to give you a comparison with the with traditional licensing. So we use some historic figures before district level licensing was available in Kent, and in the 6 months since the scheme has been live in that location, we've picked up about 60% of what we might have expected in terms of traditional licensing numbers in that area. So, which is sort of giving us a good indication of how the scheme is being received. We've not had that same pick up in Cheshire. The interest is just as high, but there's it's been quite an interesting difference in those two areas. So in Kent, the applicants are the character of those applicants is it's tending to be more numerous but smaller developers overall coming forward. In Cheshire, it's fewer but much larger. So there's an example, we've had some interest from a bypass and a garden village in Cheshire, and they're requiring large numbers of compensation ponds, which is testing our scheme really at the moment in terms of how we bring those in. But we've had a lot of habitat already delivered through the scheme, so some really good outcomes for GCN that we will monitor in the coming years. So we've already delivered 132 compensation ponds, and with a similar number planned for this financial year to keep up with demand from developers to join the scheme. And Alex described how we're allocating those as they come in. So if we just go on to the future, so what Alex spoke about there around allocating ponds, what we've been trying to do is keep ahead of that demand. So we're sort of trying to manage the supply of habitat with the demand from developers to join the scheme. That's obviously quite a difficult equation to get right. We're confident that we're staying well ahead of development, but there are some large developments wanting to come in, so it's difficult in all cases to keep up, and just shows the success of the scheme. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we're continually reviewing and improving the scheme and responding to the unique applications that we're getting. So I think from the first 6 to 8 months of operation in Kent and Cheshire, that the scheme as it stood at launch was best fitted medium-sized developments. We've made some significant changes to make it more attractive and more consistent for small developers, and I think that's having some good effect. And then on the larger end of the spectrum, as I say, we're looking at how to bring in those large developments that we're seeing interest from, particularly in Cheshire. So whether that, you know, how we manage creating that much habitat ahead of bringing them in, what the sort of some of the complexities around phasing that and so on that Alex mentioned, how we work those through so we can bring those large developments in. So we're looking at all of those and improving the scheme all the time.